You sure?
I hope so.
It's
now
live.
it says so.
Hopefully
Hey,
we're live.
we're a little early again, but we're just letting this thing buffer up and get in the zone. So we'll give it a minute to settle in and allow Caitlin down some coffee and get a good pump going.
At 7:30 at night.
Hey, nice.
That's how the pros do it.
Hey, any of you joining us live, just hit the like, send us a comment. It pops up on our screen here. Give this thing another probably 15 seconds and we'll get cooking.
More coffee.
Wow. All right. All right, let's do it. All right, so first of all, welcome to episode 20
Woo!
of the Justin and
Caitlin show.
Yeah, man, this show started on a complete whim in the middle of a pandemic and
As a joke, too, because we were like, well, what are we going to call it? And this is what happened.
the Justin and Caitlin show, something super original.
As a joke. And somehow
Yeah.
it has stuck.
Oh, it's been cool, man. And we're continuing our series in the parts of self. Tonight is the critical parent.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be spending a lot of time early on talking about what is the critical parent, building out the idea of awareness, slowing down, and ending again with how the loving adult comes into the adventure here. As I've been saying, and we've been saying last few weeks, we want to give credit to our professor, Dr. Lawson, who put together the framework of this whole idea, and we've just tinkered and messed with some little things, but he certainly was the architect, at least that we learned it from. So we give credit where credit is due. Also, those of you out there who've been following us since the beginning, or even if you just jumped on the last few weeks, thank you for that. We're going to be ending season 1 here in 2 weeks. We got next week, we got this week, we got the loving adult next week. Probably going to take at least a week off and then probably jump into like a Ask Me Anything, maybe gear it up for the holidays. We're going to figure that out. We're still going to be putting out some content on Wednesdays, but we're going to be taking a break probably till after the new year. Then mid-January, jump back into season 2 of our show. So, yeah, that's kind of a little intro spiel. And so, Caitlin, why don't you kind of help us review? I mean, we've gone through a lot the last 8-10 months, but how do we get here?
Well, not 2020, because that would be much longer than we have time for tonight. But for those of you that haven't followed our parts of self, so a few weeks ago, we started off with kind of an overview about what this all means. You know, what is the inner child? What is this adolescent? Who is the critical parent? What is this loving adult figure that we keep talking about? So for those of you that haven't watched those yet, I really encourage you to go back because that's going to give you a really good foundation to build off of.
Mm-hmm.
A couple weeks ago, we talked about the inner child. You know, this part of ourselves that is really energetic, gets excited over the little things.
That me?
And, yeah, that's you, literally you. But it's really creative and curious. And we talked about how adults who have fully incorporated this aspect of their inner child have these amazing, ridiculously crazy ideas. Let's say at work. And it's this idea that you're like, where did you even think of that? Their inner child. Then we also talked about the adolescent. So the adolescent part of ourselves, that's the risk taker. That's not afraid to try cliff jumping every now and then, or starting a brand new journey. Or for those of you in therapy, taking that risk and making those changes. But a big focus that we've been talking about is what happens when there's been wounding to either the inner child or that adolescent. And how do those parts of ourselves change? How do we actually start losing parts of who we are and adapting in order to survive? Mm-hmm. So that's really where tonight's going to come in. And Justin's going to give us a breakdown of this critical parent and what do we even mean by this critical voice, these messages that we hear, and then where do we go from there? So Justin, why don't you kick it off, actually giving us that foundation of who is this critical parent?
Yeah, and just remembering too, we had a series on attachment, you know, and that was right before we started this series. So go back and check that out because you're attachment plays into a lot of this too. Your attachment style. Go back, check out that series. They're all up. I'm gonna actually link our YouTube channel because it's organized well. Sometimes Facebook is annoying with how it's laid out. But yeah, listen. The more you can understand your background, where you fall in certain areas, it helps you understand how you got here. Because when that happens, it's like giving you the keys to the car. Because now you're aware of how you got here, which means you feel more empowered to be like, okay, well, I know how I got here. Now I feel like I could change, or I can make adjustments, or I can do what I gotta do. So man, go back, check all that stuff out. It's gonna be up there, so there's no rush. Look, critical parent can get a little complicated. I've been alluding to this for a few weeks because I wanted you to drink your coffee, get yourself pumped up, but really prep because some things can sound a little fuzzy. But look, at the end of the day, the critical parent is the part of us that is formed. We call it the adaptive self. You can hear it called the false self, and some people call it the shadow self. All three mean the same thing. It's just people want to be famous, so they create different words. For tonight, we're going to stick to the adaptive self just to keep it, the same thing going across, and it's easy to follow. So look, again, trying to lay this out just as simply and just straight up as possible. When we're born, we're essentially given a blueprint of how we're going to, in an ideal setup, which is what, is supposed to happen. This is how your personality, this is how your self, that inner self, is supposed to form. How you're going to engage the world, what skills, what gifts you're going to bring. That is an ideal setup. Okay, as long as you've spent any time here on Earth, things don't go ideal. I've yet to meet anybody who's had a wonderful, illustrious, perfect situation. So we've all go through wounding. When we're wounded as kids, that can be literal physical wounding with physical abuse, sexual abuse. This can a lot of times manifest as emotional abuse and neglect, the things we didn't get. And this is where people will struggle. We'll talk later about awareness. But it's the things you didn't get that you don't even realize you didn't get that is sometimes a big struggle in therapy to understand, because it doesn't register that was missing. Because remember, whatever you experienced at home growing up was your norm.
Yep.
So you don't know if you missed out on hugs and safe touch and being told, you're a good dude and all these things. That loving, nurturing, emotional. Caitlin talked about a tuning a few weeks ago. You don't even know you missed that because it wasn't a part of your house, but that was your normal adventure. So what happens for us is this adaptive self emerges. As we start assessing that parts of us are not accepted. Okay, I give just rudimentary examples here. And these are usually a lot more subtle and can be vicious. But just to keep this as simple again, let's say I was really into soccer and I came home so pumped up about being like joining a soccer team. And my dad says to me something like, soccer is for losers. You're going to play football or baseball. I'm going to probably, as a kid, obviously going to be upset. But what I'm going to do is cut out the part of me that likes soccer because that wasn't accepted. So I start shoveling that into the closet and burying it with hoodies. This is where the critical parent, i.e. adaptive self, comes up. I love football. I actually really like football. I'm good at football. But football is what got us accepted. Football is what got us validation. Football is what got us love from dad, even though it's conditional love, but that's what the critical parent's about. And it's conditional. But this is how this part of self emerges. If you find yourself being like a chameleon where you don't feel like you have a sense of who you are, and each situation and each person you're around, you adapt to your environment. and you tell different jokes here, or you're more quiet in this circle, or you're more loud and outgoing and like Chris Farley and Saturday Night Live in this group. Ask yourself, like, is that an adaptive thing? Because I'm trying to fit in. I didn't fit in my family system. So I want you to realize that, if we're born and given a blueprint in an ideal situation, this is what will come. However, due to wounding and issues and things that come from just our parents not getting it, or could be a sudden death, or anything can happen. We need to survive as kids. That literally is our mission. I need survival. So I will adapt to whatever I got to live. And for a lot of us, that's how we got here, in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 20s, whatever. But there does come a point that adaptive part no longer serves us. So hopefully I kind of laid that out. I don't know if I want to add anything to Caitlin that sounds on your end a little fuzzy, but just trying to lay it out that, look, this is a part of us that formed to gain acceptance and love, but it was a conditional love, and it didn't allow you to really truly be you. And that's the thing you need to remember. And that's why a lot of people struggle now, feeling like, I want to be the real me, but I don't even know who I am. Exactly. And it's because you weren't allowed to be who you are. You couldn't be that soccer player. You had to play football to be loved. So yeah. Do you have anything you want to add, or I know you're going to touch on?
Yeah. Well, it leads in perfectly with where I think a lot about the critical parent. It's really that taking that adaptive self, but it's the internalized messages that are there. And oftentimes they're very critical. Mm-hmm. So when I first start explaining this to either clients or people that I'm talking to, there's this assumption that the critical parent, that this adaptive self only forms from your parents. A critical parent figure forms from all these external messages we hear as children. This can be in school. It can be in aftercare. It can be with extended family. It can be at church. It can be at home, of course. It can be with friends. But it's all those critical external messages. And like what Justin talked about, our goal as children is to survive. We have to survive. And so if your parents tell you, I'll use this example. So one place that I worked a lot with was in a residential center with teens who had severe eating disorders. And a lot of what they had been told growing up was, you weigh too much. Your thighs are too big. Wow. Your waist is too big. And again, these are boys that are maybe 6, 7 years old. And by the time they're 11, they're not eating. Dang. Some of these are girls. So it wasn't gender specific, but their body became a big focus. For the boys, it was, you need to run more. You can't have any fat on you. You need to look more athletic. And so in order to survive, they're like, okay, well, if that's true, then I need to believe this. So by believing those external messages, they become internalized. And so what happens 10, 20, 30 years down the road is that the internal messages are so ingrained in our own heads now that the original people that told us those messages don't even have to be there.
They're long gone.
Or they might have changed their opinions by now, as society does every single day. But we, in order to survive as children, took those external messages, we believed them, internalized it, and now every time we encounter a new situation, that critical parent is there. We talked about this a little bit over summer, within months ago, but this concept of feeling like you should have done better or you should have known better. Mm-hmm. Guys, that is the critical parent. When you go in a new experience, let's say things don't turn out well, and there's this voice that says, well, you should have done better with that. You shouldn't have done that. I mean, we can learn from it, yes. But when those shoulds are constantly coming up, when that critique is constantly coming up, that's a sign of the critical parent.
Mm.
When you're about to, let's say, when you're about to go present, all of us have to talk to different amounts of people for work. And that voice starts off automatically. What if you're not good enough? What if you can't help them? What if they don't respect you? And starts bringing up times that this happened before. That's the critical parent. And so a big thing that we see and that we have to be very cautious of when working with a critical parent is actually beginning this process of gaining awareness of how often these messages actually come out.
Mm-hmm.
How often are these messages actually impacting your day-to-day life? And this is where having a support system or being in therapy, whichever one you choose, comes into play. Because you have someone else that can challenge you on these things when that critical parent starts up and we don't even realize it. But it is gaining that awareness because, again, in order to survive, we took those external messages, we believed them, and internalized them. So where now the cycle just continues in our head every single time we do want to try something new. We do want to engage in a new friendship or relationship. We do want to have a deeper conversation with someone. We do want to go on a new adventure. That critical parent will start talking. A big way you'll see this as well is when you feel like you're hustling for love or for acceptance. That is a big sign that the critical parent is driving. So kind of like the metaphor we used a couple weeks ago, figuring out where these different parts of self are driving the car. The critical parent oftentimes is driving a lot more than what we think. And when you feel like you are constantly hustling for love or for acceptance, like what Justin said, when you feel like you're a chameleon and kind of just blending in to gain that acceptance and that love and that approval, that is a sign that the critical parent's driving.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear these very loud internal messages that are critiquing you, telling you where you're not good enough, that's another sign. So as you guys begin this process of saying, okay, where do we even go with this? The first part is gaining that awareness of when do these messages come up? Okay, how often do they come up? Are there certain situations that make them come up more often than others? Because those are always very interesting to try to dissect. Is why do certain situations, why do certain engagements with different people cause the critical parent to be louder than other times? Ironically, critical parents are usually the loudest when we're about to engage something that's part of our true self.
Yep.
When something that would have if little you didn't have to adapt so much and form that adaptive self, things that little you actually would have really enjoyed, that's usually when the critical parent gets the loudest. Because like what Justin said, those unfortunately were things that were cut down when we were little. I teach dance outside of doing therapy. And we do have little boys that come in and they want to take ballet. They want to take jazz. They want to take tap. They want to take hip hop. And they get so excited. They're like 3 or 4 years old, super excited. But you always can see in their faces when someone's told them that little boys don't dance. And that heartbreak that happens when their eyes change, their face changes. And suddenly you see them stop dancing and doing things that other people have told them are more socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this joy, and I know, Justin, you're going to end up jumping in on this later, that comes as we deal with the critical parent part, where you're able to then start engaging in things that truly do bring you happiness according to your true self. And there's just a difference there. Your eyes light up differently. Your face lights up differently. So no, Justin, you talking about this gaining awareness, a big thing for you is also slowing down. And you have a different car metaphor that you use. So I'll let you Let you use your other car metaphor.
Yeah. And actually, I realized I forgot a bullet point up top. And actually, thank the Lord, it ties into where you were going.
Great.
And so, one thing to remember is the adaptive self, for most of us, has been in charge since we were yay high. Okay?
Yep.
It does not want to lose its job, its position. So as you start to change, what Caitlin was getting at, when you start connecting to your child, when you start connecting to your true self, when you start writing out a new story, that critical parent is going to want to fight you tooth and nail, because when you really connect and integrate these things and start walking out that original blueprint, the critical parent essentially loses its job. And it knows that. And so it's going to fight you tooth and nail to not be fired, basically. And so if you're in the journey of change and you start feeling yourself coming up against that wall where you're getting beat down mentally, you're not good enough, you're never going to change. What are you thinking? This was a stupid idea. See, you can't trust people. Be aware that it's trying to protect itself, and in the same token, protect you. Remember, in a sick way, this critical beating down, so to speak, has kept you safe, i.e. accepted. And so this is where it gets complicated. It's this whole adaptive thing and this critical nature has kept you alive and it has protected you, but it's also caused harm. So I forgot to mention that, but it tied into what Caitlin was getting at.
Yeah.
So I am in the process of getting ready to build a muscle car with some new school stuff in it. So those of you who are my clients, be prepared for some more car metaphors.
Non-stop, guys. Non-stop.
Yeah, I'm I like loud noises in cars. So look, going from a muscle car to a Prius. Look, here's the deal, and I talk about this so much, but it's so important. And I bring up the Prius because it's such a slow car. If you drive a Prius, you know that, okay? And I compare it to a Corvette. A lot of us spend our lives in the Corvette. Now look, a Corvette, especially a new one, really cool ride, okay? Goes 0 to 100 very quickly. And for a lot of us, that's how we live our life. It's through this adrenaline and cortisol rush. We've talked about that in other episodes. But here's the deal. If we're going from 0 to 100 miles an hour, we don't really ever see the 45 mile an hour zone, the 55 miles an hour zone. Usually what we see is the red and blue lights of the cop car pulling us over for blowing through those areas with, our Corvette. And I'll get to that in a sec. However, if we get in our Prius, it may not be the sexiest car. It may not win awards. But it's going to be reliable, and it's going to get you the same destination, but it's going to be slower. So you can see the speed limit changes from 35 to 45, back to 35 to 55. You can see this occurring. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for your life? To what Caitlin's talking about. It's really hard to be aware of this critical parent driving the car and taking control of our lives if we're in a Corvette. Because our hair is on fire, we're just got our foot mashed down on the gas, and we're hauling. We don't even know how we got here. And that's why we made mention at the beginning of this episode, go back and watch our attachment series. Go back and watch the beginnings of these episodes on parts of self. Get attuned to who you are. How did you get to be what you are? Understand how some of these puzzle pieces have fallen into your life and how they got there. Because it's with that if you can get in the Prius and slow down your life, you start understanding more and you start having different conversations with people. Let me give you an example. So, okay, let's just pretend it's me or something, right? Or a guy in the example. All right, let's say I have a business meeting, okay? And at the meeting, I get criticized in front of like 8 of my other coworkers by the boss. Let's say, I was late to work and I got my presentation in later, it was sucked or something, I don't know. Okay, so I get criticized in front of everybody. And let's say that criticism and not feeling good enough is a huge red button trigger for me. Okay, so I feel all kinds of things, okay, that aren't good. All right, so the shame and all those things are like really just beating me down. I come home from work, I'm in my Corvette, and this is what I was getting at earlier with the whole blowing through the speed limit signs, and then we see the cop, okay? I come home. Let's say me and Andrea typically eat dinner at 6. Okay, that's not true, but let's pretend. Okay, and it's now 6:15 and dinner's not ready, and now I blow a cork. Okay, I am pissed. And I lose my crap on Andrea about dinner being 15 minutes late. That's what happens when we're in the Corvette and we haven't acknowledged A, the driver has switched in the car, i.e. critical parent, that has been beating on me, which has caused me to be infuriated with myself, but I'm going to project it out on others, usually our loved ones. That's how it happens. So here's an alternative for those of you out there. Okay? And I explain this to a lot of my male clients, dudes who are married or dating and whatever. Put the Corvette in the garage. Put the car cover on it. Take the Prius. Let me show you how this changes. We get criticized in a meeting. Same thing happens. Let's say that we had a meeting at 12 o'clock, but I work till 5:30. I go back to my cubicle or my office or whatever. I can acknowledge the fact that I was just criticized in front of a group of people. That's really hurtful. That definitely triggered my inner child, who is now really hurt, is really anxious, which is then going to cause my adolescent to fire up and be angry and want to protect little man. And now I can nurture and engage the inner child. I can come alongside the adolescent. In these episodes we did the week prior, last Wednesday, and the one before, we talked about how this process works. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this. But we can learn to calm ourselves down. And if you got to cry, guess what? Especially fellas, that's okay. It's a good thing. God gave you tear ducts for a reason. It's okay to use them. So that means if I can walk through that, or at least start to, and this isn't a perfect, hey, I'm wonderful now. But now when I come home in my Prius and I've at least acknowledged the fact that I've been triggered and hurt because of this meeting, I don't care about dinner being late because it was never about that anyway. I could sit down and say, Andrea, I had a really hard day. I got criticized by the boss in front of the whole team. I feel ashamed and I feel like crap and I'm really hurt. Do you see the massive difference in conversations that just occurred? One is a blowout argument that had nothing to do with Andrea. I'm just making this up. But the other is acknowledging what happened in my hurts. And you may not totally get it, and that's okay. But it's slowing down enough to let the real issues be dealt with and not just shooting it out onto those closest to us. Yeah. So yeah, that's like a big go-to for me. And I think when you were talking, Caitlin, about, kind of breaks my heart, man. It kind of does, with those young dudes 3 and 4 dancing and wanting to do hip hop and all that. It reminds me of that lion that was put in the zoo. You could just tell in the lion's posture that it was just doesn't want to be there, and it's something was taken from it. You can see deep into that lion's eye that wild lion's there, but this adaptive thing has had to come out because it's now in a big cage.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I was visualizing with those little dudes. So, I know originally I was going to talk about this, but Caitlin, why don't you talk about it? Because you had a cool little, I don't know, call it vision? I don't know, dream? I don't know what you want to call it, but
Image.
Let's go with that. How does a loving adult come alongside this critical parent? Because I think the easy thing for us to do is say we want to kick it out of the car, run it over, go forward, run it over again, put it back in reverse, and run it over a third time just to make sure. When in reality, not the best route. But I think you have a cool image to lay out.
Yeah. So my critical parent was definitely very strong, very much a perfectionist. And I struggled with that before grad school, throughout grad school. And I remember Dr. Lawson, when he first brought this critical parent part, I was like, oh yeah, mine drives. Like all the time. This is great. And then through therapy, through this process, this anger did occur of, I don't want to be critiqued all the time. And where did these messages actually originate? And realizing they originated with people who said that they loved me or were trying to support me in a way, but that actually were tearing apart who I was as a person. And so there was this point, I think it's about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, where usually whenever I thought of the critical parent, all this anger would emerge. Like tons of anger and frustration and pain. And for the first time, it was almost like the loving adult part of me. I felt like I was almost hugging the critical parent and saying, I understand why you're here. Again, you came from these external messages. And me as a little kid, in order to survive, believed them. And they got internalized. So I get why you're here. I get why you've been internalized. I get, in a way, I'm trying to survive. But I don't need you anymore. I don't need you to critique me into being perfect anymore. I don't need you to critique me into acting a certain way anymore. I can actually handle it now. And there is that power, even if you think about it with real adults and imagine this with little kids. When that loving adult gets stronger and stronger, and when you have a confident, loving, peaceful adult, children do feel more at peace. Teens are much more stable. They're much more consistent. But even those very critical individuals, they also usually quiet down around these adults. They don't have as much to say. And so that was what really changed for me. It was that point of where I stopped trying to kick it out of the car. But I realized, yeah, you can't come on this journey anymore. But I'm not going to do it out of hatred or anger. I get why you're here. I get why I believe those messages. But those messages are also lies. So I get it. But I don't need you to drive. I don't need you to tell me how to live. And I can handle it. But that process took time. That was definitely not a week-long process. Like this was years of understanding.
Yeah.
It was. And Justin and I, we both talk about this process of really doing deep transformative work in therapy, not being a 1-month process. No. But it could be 6 months. Could be a year. For some of us, like I came into therapy having extensive trauma. I know, Justin, you have gone through a lot as well. It took us a few years of really diving deep, walking through this to understand how ingrained this critical parent was, how shut down our inner child was, and how fully pissed off and furious our adolescent was with how life was going. But there does come that point as your loving adult gets stronger that it is possible to look at the critical parent and say, I get why you're here, but I can handle it from now on.
And that's the big message for the loving adult, which sends us to next week. But because next week's the loving adult, and wrapping up this series, but it's the loving adult saying, I know why you got here. Thank you for getting us and helping us survive. Thank you. But I can handle it from here. And I know this is hard. And it's going to cause a grieving. You're going to feel really weird about it, but it's going to cause a grieving because there's a part of you that is leaving. And even though it's not a part of the true self, so to speak, it was still a part of you for 30, 40, however many years old you are, whatever. Yeah. So it does cause a grieving process. But it is that loving adult saying, hey, dude, I love you. I very much appreciate you. Thank you. But I got it from here. And so, yeah. Check it out. I think this is the end of the show. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody. We got next week for Loving Adult. We're going to take a week off, come back with a Ask Me Anything kind of setup. And then that'll be the end of season 1. But I will just stay on here. We'll just stare at the screen awkwardly for a minute or two. If anybody's got any questions, I know there's a bunch of you watching live. If you got any questions that you'd like answered, we'll give this thing a minute or two and we'll just stare at the screen awkwardly to allow you to type and let it pop up. So we'll open it up for some questions because I know this critical parent and inner child can both be pretty heavy and intense. So if you got any questions, fire away. I'll try not to pick my nose on live TV here and
oh man. Yeah, there's actually, I'll read this out loud while you're waiting for a comment. Did you already get a comment or no?
No, I just like seeing what people do in awkward silence.
Oh. I was reading my notes because I have the one that Dr. Lawson gave us. So for those of you that want like the timeline on this, for the critical parent, and this got all of us because we were like, dang it. So looking good was linked to having control.
Oh, to fear.
Was linked to fear. And then to shame. And then feeling safety in that. And then this is good. So if you follow that, seems very convoluted. But when you're thinking about the critical parent, it is literally ruling your true self through shame, through fear, in order to be good enough, in order to feel like you have control over a situation, to feel safe or to be safe.
Well, I don't see any questions. I don't want to stare at this waiting much longer. So we'll catch y'all next Wednesday, 7:30, where we wrap this show up with the loving adult. Bring your questions for that. That one, to be fair, will be short because, to be honest, it's a bit cut and dry on how the loving adult engages. The process of growing it in therapy is different, but that's it for the Justin and
Caitlin show,
episode 20.
Until our holiday episode.
Yeah, catch y'all next week.
Bye.